In the janitorial department of a company, a black single mother struggling to survive was fired simply for letting an elderly woman take shelter from the rain. But even when backed into a corner, she refused to turn her back on the old woman. Upon learning that the old woman had been abandoned by her son, the black woman didn't hesitate to take her in, caring for her with everything she had. The next morning, a luxury car pulled up in front of her tiny apartment, revealing a shocking truth. The woman she had taken in wasn't a helpless old lady. She was someone with the power to change the black woman's life forever. Naomi's alarm buzzed at 4 a.m., slicing through the thick silence of her tiny apartment. She sighed, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes before slipping out of bed as quietly as possible. In the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the cracked blinds, she glanced at the frail form of her 12-year-old son Jaden, curled up under a too-thin blanket on the worn-out mattress they shared. His breathing was steady, but she heard the occasional wheeze. His asthma was acting up again. She reached for the bottle of medicine on the rickety nightstand and frowned. It was almost empty. She didn't have time to dwell on it. Rent was due, bills were piling up, and she had just enough money to get them through the week, if nothing went wrong. Naomi pulled on her faded blue uniform, the material stiff and coarse from too many washes. She grabbed her work boots, laced them up, and threw on an old windbreaker over her shoulders. A stale piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, her only breakfast, went into her pocket. Stepping outside, she braced against the cold bite of the early morning air. The city was barely awake, the streets still wrapped in the quiet gloom of dawn. Naomi walked briskly toward the bus stop, her boots slapping against the damp pavement. A storm had been brewing all night, thick clouds stretching over the city like a heavy blanket. The air smelled of wet concrete, of something waiting to break loose. She reached the downtown district just as the first raindrops started to fall. Within seconds, the drizzle turned into a downpour, the wind howling through the towering buildings. Naomi pulled her hood up, but the thin fabric was no match for the sheets of rain drenching the streets. She picked up her pace, gripping her small bag tightly, her mind already focused on the hours of sweeping, scrubbing, and hauling she had ahead. Then she saw her. An elderly white woman standing under the awning of a closed storefront, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. Her silver hair clung to her forehead, her rain-soaked clothes sticking to her frame. She wasn't ragged, not a homeless drifter. Her beige coat was modest, her shoes sensible, though now soaked through. She seemed out of place, like she had been caught somewhere she never intended to be. Naomi hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. "Ma'am, you can't stand here like this," she said, raising her voice over the roar of the rain. "You'll catch a cold." The woman turned, startled. Her blue eyes flickered with uncertainty as she took in Naomi's uniform, her dark skin, the weary lines on her face. "I was waiting for my son," the woman said finally, "but She gestured weakly to the sky, as if the storm itself had foiled her plans. Naomi nodded. "Come with me. My workplace is just around the corner. You can get dry there." The woman hesitated again. Naomi was used to it, that moment of calculation, of deciding whether she was someone to be trusted, whether she was someone worth trusting. White folks did that a lot. Some were subtle about it, some weren't. But the rain was relentless, and Naomi wasn't about to let an old woman stand out here and freeze. She didn't wait for an answer, she simply moved, expecting the woman to follow. After a pause, the woman did. Naomi led her into the side entrance of the janitorial office, a small, cluttered space where she and the other cleaning staff kept their supplies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow. She grabbed an old but clean t-shirt she kept in her locker and handed it over. "Here," she said. "It's not fancy, but at least it's dry." The woman hesitated again, looking at Naomi with something unreadable in her expression. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. Naomi huffed a short, tired laugh. "Lady, I don't have to do a lot of things." She turned away, pulling off her soaked windbreaker and draping it over the back of a chair. She rummaged through her bag and pulled out the napkin-wrapped piece of bread. It wasn't much, but she extended it toward the woman. "Eat," Naomi said simply. The woman stared at the offering for a long moment. Then, with a small, almost reluctant nod, she took it. A faint smile ghosted over her lips as she broke the bread in half. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Naomi," she said, shaking out her damp sleeves. "Margaret." Naomi nodded. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. Just wish it were under better circumstances." Margaret chuckled, a sound barely audible over the hum of the flickering light. Then, discreetly, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket and typed out a quick message. "Don't come yet. I have something else to take care of. I'll call when I'm ready." She pressed send, and with that Margaret sat back in the chair, watching Naomi move about the room. There was something about the woman that intrigued her, the way she gave so freely, the way she carried the weight of her struggles without complaint. Margaret had met many people in her life. She could tell when someone was real. She decided she wanted to see more, and so she stayed. The rain continued to hammer against the windows as Naomi busied herself in the janitor's office, wringing out the sleeves of her uniform. Margaret sat quietly in the chair Naomi had offered her, sipping from a disposable coffee cup Naomi had managed to scavenge from the break room. Her hands, still trembling slightly from the cold, wrapped tightly around it as if trying to absorb whatever warmth remained. Naomi checked the time. She had to start her shift. She glanced at Margaret, debating whether she should leave her alone, but the woman seemed content, her eyes flickering around the room, taking in every little detail. "Listen," Naomi said, fastening her utility belt. "I gotta get to work. You can stay here a while, dry off. Just don't let anyone catch you. My boss is an ass." Margaret lifted a brow, the faintest trace of amusement on her face. "Noted." Naomi gave her a small nod before stepping out, the fluorescent lights of the main hallway buzzing as she walked into the empty office corridors. The place was always eerily quiet at this hour, the echoes of her boots bouncing off the walls. Most people never noticed janitors. They walked right past them like ghosts, like they weren't worth a second thought. Naomi had learned not to care. She grabbed her cart and started wiping down the counters, her hands moving with the ease of repetition. As she worked, she thought about Margaret. How strange it was that the woman had ended up at her doorstep, how quickly Naomi had decided to help. Maybe she was just tired of seeing people struggle. Maybe she was just tired of struggling herself. She was halfway through scrubbing a stubborn stain off the break room counter when a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Naomi." She froze. The voice belonged to Susan Parker, her supervisor. A thin, white woman in her 50s with pinched lips and a permanent expression of disapproval, Susan was the kind of boss who didn't just manage people, she ruled over them. Naomi turned slowly, gripping the rag in her hand as Susan approached, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Susan's eyes flickered with irritation. "There's a woman sitting in the janitor's office." Naomi tensed. "Yeah. Who is she?" "A lady I helped out," Naomi said carefully. "She got caught in the rain." Susan exhaled sharply, like Naomi had personally insulted her. "This is not a shelter, Naomi. This is a workplace. Do I need to remind you of that?" Naomi's jaw tightened. "She's not bothering anyone." Susan folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "I don't care. You people always think you can bend the rules, bringing in whoever you want, acting like this is your personal space. It's not. It's a business, and you're here to do your job, not play social worker." Naomi felt something hot coil in her stomach. You people. She'd heard that phrase enough times in her life to know exactly what it meant. Susan stepped closer, voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "If I let you bring in some random vagrant, what's next? Should we let the whole damn street in? Maybe you'd like to turn the office into a soup kitchen." Naomi's fingers curled around the rag in her hand. She stared at Susan, at the smug way she looked down on her, at the way she didn't even try to hide what she really thought. "She's not a vagrant," Naomi said, voice steady. "She was just waiting for her son. She got caught in the rain." Susan scoffed. "Then she can wait for him somewhere else." Naomi's blood pounded in her ears. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the familiar taste of injustice burning at the back of her throat. She knew how this was going to go. It didn't matter what she said. Susan had already decided she was wrong. "Get rid of her," Susan ordered, her tone final, "or you're done here." Naomi stared at her, the rag damp in her grip. For a split second, she thought about apologizing, about nodding and backing down like she'd been forced to so many times before. But then she thought about Margaret, about the way the woman had shivered in the rain, about how easily people like Susan dismissed others simply because they didn't fit into their pristine little world. She pulled off her work badge and dropped it onto the counter between them. It landed with a small, definitive clink. "Then I'm done." Susan blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "I'm done," Naomi repeated, stepping back from the cart. "You can clean your own damn counters." Susan's mouth opened and closed, searching for something to say, but Naomi didn't wait. She turned on her heel and walked out, her heart pounding in her chest, a strange mix of anger and liberation coursing through her veins. Margaret was still sitting in the janitor's office when Naomi returned. She looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. "Everything all right?" Naomi let out a slow breath, then grabbed her bag from the corner of the room. "Let's go." Margaret frowned. "Go where?" Naomi adjusted the strap over her shoulder. "You need a ride somewhere?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "I don't have anywhere to go." Naomi looked at her, studying the way her hands trembled slightly, the exhaustion lining her face. Something deep in her chest clenched. "All right," Naomi said finally. "Then you're coming with me." And with that she held the door open. Margaret took one last look at the empty office, then at Naomi, before rising from her chair and stepping out into the rain once more. By the time they reached Naomi's apartment, the rain had faded into a soft drizzle, the afternoon sky a dull gray. The city smelled of damp asphalt and yesterday's mistakes, the kind that never quite washed away. Naomi led Margaret up the narrow stairwell of her building, the rusted railings cold beneath her fingertips. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the kind of place people passed by without a second thought. It wasn't much, but it was home. She unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting Margaret take in the cramped living room. A couch that had seen better days, a tiny dining table pushed against the wall, and a flickering light above the sink that buzzed faintly every time it rained. A pile of unopened bills sat stacked neatly in the corner, an unspoken reminder of the life Naomi was barely holding together. "Come in," Naomi said, kicking off her wet shoes. "Ain't fancy, but it's dry." Margaret hesitated for half a second before stepping inside, carefully shrugging off the old jacket Naomi had given her. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the framed picture of a young boy sitting on the shelf. "Your son?" she asked, picking it up gently. "Yeah, Jaden," Naomi said, pulling out a chair for Margaret at the small table. "He's at a friend's place. I usually work late, so he stays over sometimes." Margaret nodded, setting the photo back down. "He's lucky." Naomi snorted, shaking her head. "Lucky? Ain't nothing lucky about growing up in a place like this. I work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and half the time I still come up short." She gestured toward the stack of bills. "But I make it work, somehow." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Life isn't easy, is it?" she murmured. Naomi let out a bitter laugh. "Not for people like me." Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "I understand what it's like to struggle," she said quietly. "I had a home once, a family, but things changed, and suddenly I had nothing." Naomi glanced at her, something flickering in her chest. She had seen a lot of people down on their luck, but Margaret didn't quite fit the image. She wasn't ragged, wasn't worn the way long-term hardship left its mark. But Naomi knew better than to question someone else's pain. "So you got no one?" Naomi asked. Margaret smiled, but it was a tired, hollow thing. "No one who wants me." The words sat heavy between them. Naomi exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. She didn't have time for this. She had her own problems, her own battles to fight, but damn it, she wasn't about to send an old woman back into the streets. "Well," Naomi said, pushing back her chair, "you don't have to sleep outside. If you got nowhere to go, you can stay here, least for a little while." Margaret's eyes widened slightly as if she hadn't expected the offer. "Naomi, you don't have to—" "I know," Naomi cut in. "I ain't gotta do a lot of things. But I'm doing it anyway." Margaret studied her, searching for something in Naomi's face. Whatever she found made her nod slowly. "Thank you," she said softly. Naomi waved it off. "Don't make a big deal out of it. Just don't snore too loud." Margaret chuckled, the first real laugh Naomi had heard from her. As the day stretched on, they talked more. About small things, unimportant things. Naomi told Margaret about the long shifts at work, about the people who barely looked at her when she cleaned up after them. She told her about Jaden, about how smart he was, how he deserved better than this life. Margaret listened, nodding at the right moments, offering quiet reassurances. In return, Margaret told Naomi about the life she had lost. She spoke of a house she once had, of a time when she wasn't alone. She didn't mention her son, not really, just that there was a time when she had family, and then there wasn't. Naomi didn't press. When night finally came, Naomi set up a blanket on the couch for Margaret. The apartment was small, but she made sure Margaret had enough space to rest. "You need anything?" Naomi asked, standing in the doorway. Margaret shook her head. "No, this is more than enough." Naomi nodded. "All right." "Night then." Margaret watched as Naomi retreated to the bedroom, the door clicking shut behind her. She sat in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds, her hands resting lightly on the old blanket Naomi had given her. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her phone. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Then she typed, "I'll need you to come get me in the morning. I'll explain everything then." She hit send, then placed the phone face down on the table. For the first time in a long time, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself rest. The sun barely crept over the city skyline when Naomi stirred awake, the distant hum of morning traffic seeping through the thin walls of her apartment. She blinked against the faint light, exhaustion weighing heavy in her limbs. Last night had been the first in months that she hadn't gone to bed worrying about work, because there was no work to go back to. The thought sat like a stone in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She had bigger things to deal with now. Throwing on an old hoodie, Naomi padded into the small living room. Margaret was already up, sitting quietly on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea Naomi didn't even remember making. The older woman's posture was relaxed, but there was something in her eyes, something settled, as if she had reached a conclusion Naomi wasn't yet aware of. "Morning," Naomi muttered, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Morning," Margaret replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Naomi went to check the fridge, hoping there was at least a scrap of breakfast left. A single egg, half a loaf of bread, and the last of the milk stared back at her. She exhaled sharply through her nose, grabbing the bread and setting it on the counter. "I'll make toast," she said. Margaret's gaze lingered on her, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Naomi felt it, that unspoken weight in the air, but she ignored it. She had spent too many years learning when not to ask questions. They ate in silence, the sound of rain from the night before still dripping from the roof outside. Naomi focused on the way Margaret held her mug, the way her fingers trembled just slightly when she lifted it to her lips. She was thinking about something. And then a knock at the door. Naomi frowned, glancing at the clock. Too early for Jaden, too early for anyone she knew. She stood, wiping her hands on her sweatpants, and moved to the door. Margaret, however, remained perfectly still, eyes locked onto the table as if she already knew what was coming. Naomi hesitated for only a second before unlocking the deadbolt and pulling the door open. A man stood there, tall, sharply dressed, with neatly combed silver-streaked hair and a presence that filled the tiny hallway. His suit was crisp despite the humid air, the kind of expensive tailoring Naomi had only ever seen on people who never had to worry about rent. His expression was unreadable, but his blue eyes, familiar blue eyes, shifted past Naomi and landed on Margaret. "Mother," Naomi's breath caught. Slowly she turned back toward Margaret. The older woman exhaled, setting her mug down with a quiet clink. So this was it, the lie unraveling. Naomi's chest tightened. "Mother?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. She turned fully to Margaret, her brows furrowed. "You told me you had no one." Margaret sighed. standing up with the kind of grace that didn't belong to someone who had spent the night on a lumpy couch. She smoothed out the creases in Naomi's old sweater, the same one Naomi had given her in the rain, and turned toward the man at the door. "I see you got my message," Margaret said evenly. The man, her son, didn't acknowledge it. His gaze flickered toward Naomi, scanning her like he was piecing together what had happened. Naomi folded her arms tightly over her chest, her pulse hammering. She had been played, used. "You lied," Naomi said, her voice flat. Margaret turned back to her, her face calm but sincere. "I didn't lie, Naomi," she said softly. "But I didn't tell you everything either." Naomi let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Ain't that the same damn thing?" Margaret took a step closer, but Naomi held up a hand. "No, you sat right there and told me your son didn't want you, that you had nowhere to go." She gestured toward the man still standing in the doorway. "And the whole time you had this—" Margaret's face was filled with something Naomi couldn't quite place. Regret, but not shame. She met Naomi's gaze head on. "I needed to know," she said simply. "I needed to see if kindness still existed in this world, and Naomi, you showed me that it does." Naomi stared at her, chest rising and falling with the weight of too many thoughts crashing into each other. The frustration, the confusion, the sting of realizing she had been tested like some kind of experiment. But Margaret's voice was calm, steady, without a hint of manipulation. Margaret continued, "I had to be sure. People help when they think someone has nothing, out of pity, out of guilt. But you helped without hesitation. You gave me your food, your warmth, your home, even when you had so little to give." She gestured around the apartment, her expression softening. "You have so little, Naomi, and yet you gave me everything." Naomi's jaw tightened. She wanted to stay angry. She wanted to tell Margaret to take her rich son and her expensive clothes and get the hell out of her apartment. But the truth was, Naomi had met a lot of people in her life, people who looked through her, past her, like she didn't matter. Margaret hadn't done that. Margaret had listened. Margaret had seen her. Naomi inhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. "So what now?" she muttered. Margaret glanced at her son, then back at Naomi. "That's up to you," she said gently, "but I don't want to walk away without telling you the truth, without thanking you the way you deserve." Naomi swallowed hard. She didn't trust easily, and she damn sure didn't take well to being tested, but for some reason, looking into Margaret's eyes, she didn't see manipulation. She didn't see someone playing a game. She just saw a woman who had needed to know there were still good people in the world. Naomi sighed, shaking her head. "Damn, lady," she muttered. "You sure know how to make a person's morning complicated." Margaret chuckled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "It's a gift." Naomi rolled her eyes, but despite herself a smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "Fine, but you better tell your son to stop staring at me like I stole his mama." Margaret laughed, turning to the man. "This is Naomi," she told him, "the woman who reminded me why kindness still matters." The man finally relaxed, nodding slightly. "Thank you," he said simply. Naomi exhaled. She still didn't know what to make of all this, but for now she just nodded back. Yeah, just make sure she gets a real breakfast. She ain't eat enough toast to keep a bird alive." Margaret smiled. "Oh, I think I'll be just fine." And for the first time since Naomi had met her, she truly believed it. Months passed, and Naomi's life no longer looked like the one she had once known. Gone were the days of back-breaking shifts that left her too tired to think. Gone were the nights spent staring at unpaid bills, wondering how she would make it to the next month. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something. The foundation Margaret had envisioned, the Second Chance Initiative, had become a reality, and Naomi was at the heart of it. She spent her days working directly with people who had once been like her, single mothers struggling to keep their children fed, laborers cast aside after years of hard work, people who just needed a hand to hold on to before they could pull themselves up. She made sure the foundation didn't just throw money at problems, but provided real opportunities, job training, child care support, housing assistance. She wanted to help the kind of people society ignored, the ones who had been told to just work harder while the system kept them down. And the best part? She did it her way. No fancy boardrooms, no condescending speeches from people who had never known a hungry night. When folks walked into the center, they weren't met with pity. They were met with respect, because Naomi knew, better than anyone, that dignity was the first thing poverty tried to steal, and she refused to let that happen. At home, things changed too. Jaden no longer had to worry about his mom working herself to exhaustion. She had time for him now, time to help with homework, to sit down for dinner without feeling like she might fall asleep at the table. He saw his mother not as someone constantly weighed down by the world, but as someone who had beaten it. One evening, as Naomi locked up the foundation's office, Margaret stood beside her, watching the lights flicker across the city skyline. "You've built something incredible here," Margaret said softly. Naomi smirked, crossing her arms. "Well, I had a good investor." Margaret chuckled. "No, Naomi, you had a good heart." Naomi exhaled, looking at the building one last time before turning toward home. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just fighting to get by. She was winning. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.